The autumn morning arrived cold and clear over Millbrook, Kansas, the kind of day that made the prairie grass shimmer gold in the early light and reminded people why they'd chosen to build lives in this unforgiving but beautiful landscape. Emma Hartwell stood in the bakery kitchen before dawn as she did every morning, her hands deep in bread dough, working it with the practiced rhythm that came from years of rising early to prepare the goods that would feed the town throughout the day. The physical work was demanding, required strength and endurance that Emma possessed in abundance, though people rarely acknowledged her capabilities, seeing only her size and judging everything else through that narrow lens. She loved these quiet hours before the shop opened, when the bakery belonged only to her and the simple satisfaction of creating something good with her own hands. The bread rising in the warmth of the ovens, the sweet smell of cinnamon rolls baking, the delicate pastries taking shape under her skilled fingers, all of it brought contentment that had nothing to do with other people's opinions. Emma had learned over 23 years that her worth couldn't depend on external validation, that she had to find it within herself, or spend her entire life waiting for approval that would never come from people determined to see her as less than she was. The bell above the bakery door chimed at 7 o'clock sharp, announcing the first customer of the day. Emma wiped flour from her hands and moved to the counter, recognizing Mrs. Peterson, one of the town's most prominent ladies and also one of its cruelest gossips. The older woman's eyes barely registered Emma's presence, looking past her as if she were part of the furniture rather than a person, ordering her usual items with the dismissive tone reserved for servants or people considered beneath notice. Emma packaged the order with quiet efficiency, accepted payment, and watched Mrs. Peterson leave without the simple courtesy of a thank you or acknowledgement of the quality of the goods she'd just purchased. The morning continued in similar fashion, a steady stream of customers who took Emma's excellent baking for granted while treating her with casual disrespect that ranged from cold politeness to open disdain. She'd grown accustomed to being invisible, to having people discuss her as if she weren't standing right there, to overhearing comments about her appearance delivered in voices just loud enough to ensure she heard. The cruelty was constant, but rarely direct enough to confront, existing in the space between what was said and what was meant, in looks and sighs and the deliberate turning away that communicated rejection more clearly than words ever could. Around mid-morning, as Emma was arranging fresh pastries in the display case, the bell chimed again and she looked up to see Thomas Brennan entering the shop. Thomas was owner of the Double B Ranch, the largest cattle operation in the county, a man in his late 30s who'd built his prosperity through hard work and fair dealing. He was tall and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with the quiet confidence that came from competence rather than arrogance. Emma had seen him in town occasionally, but had never spoken with him directly, had no reason to expect he even knew she existed, beyond being the person who sold him bread when he happened to stop at the bakery. Thomas approached the counter with a polite nod, his hat in his hands, and surprised Emma by addressing her by name. He said good morning to Miss Hartwell, asked how she was doing, and waited for her response as if he genuinely cared about the answer rather than just following empty social convention. The simple courtesy was so unusual that Emma found herself momentarily flustered, uncertain how to respond to being treated like a person whose thoughts and feelings might matter. She managed a quiet reply that she was well, thank you, and asked what she could get for him. He ordered several items, making conversation about the quality of her baking in terms that showed he actually paid attention to what he was eating, rather than just consuming it mindlessly. He mentioned that the cinnamon rolls she made were the best he'd ever tasted, that the bread had perfect texture and flavor, that his ranch hands always requested her goods when he offered to bring supplies from town. The compliments were specific and genuine, coming from someone who clearly appreciated skill and effort, and Emma felt warmth that had nothing to do with the bakery ovens spreading through her chest at being recognized for her actual abilities. As she packaged his order, Thomas cleared his throat in the way people do when they're about to say something they've been working up courage to express. He mentioned that the harvest dance was coming up in 3 days, the annual event that marked the end of growing season and brought the entire community together for a rare evening of celebration and socializing. Emma nodded politely, knowing about the dance but having no plans to attend, having learned through painful experience that such events were exercises in humiliation for someone like her, standing on the sidelines watching others enjoy themselves while pretending not to notice the pitying or mocking glances thrown her direction. Thomas continued, his words coming more quickly now as if he needed to get them out before losing nerve. He said he knew this was perhaps forward, and she should feel absolutely free to decline. But he would be honored if she would consider attending the dance as his guest, if she would allow him the privilege of her company for the evening. The request was so unexpected, so completely outside anything Emma had imagined, that for a moment she couldn't process what he was actually asking. Surely she'd misunderstood. Surely he meant something else. Because men like Thomas Brennan didn't invite women like her to dances, didn't seek their company voluntarily, didn't expose themselves to the social judgment that would inevitably come from choosing someone the town had collectively decided was unworthy of such attention. She stood frozen, staring at him with expression that probably looked foolish, trying to determine if this was some kind of cruel joke, some elaborate setup designed to humiliate her even more thoroughly than usual. But Thomas's face showed nothing but earnest hope and slight nervousness, the look of someone who genuinely put himself in vulnerable position and was waiting to see if his gesture would be accepted or rejected. He added quietly that he understood if she preferred not to, that he wouldn't be offended by a refusal, but that he'd noticed her in town over the past year since he'd been coming to Millbrook regularly, had come to respect her skill and grace, and would genuinely enjoy her company if she was willing to give him the chance. Emma's immediate instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from what seemed like inevitable disappointment or worse. She opened her mouth to politely decline, to make some excuse about being too busy, or not feeling well, or any of the dozen deflections she'd perfected over years, of avoiding situations where her presence made others uncomfortable. But something in Thomas's expression stopped her, some quality of sincerity that suggested this wasn't performance or joke, but actual genuine interest. And beneath her protective instincts, beneath the layers of learned defensiveness, a small voice asked why she should automatically assume she didn't deserve this, why she should refuse something she actually wanted, because other people had convinced her she wasn't worth wanting. The silence stretched long enough to become awkward before Emma finally responded, her voice quieter than she'd intended, saying yes, she would be honored to attend the dance with him. Thank you for asking. Thomas's face broke into a smile of genuine pleasure, not the relieved expression of someone who'd completed unpleasant obligation, but the happy look of someone who'd received gift they'd hoped for. He said that was wonderful, that he'd call for her at her family's home at 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, that he looked forward to it more than he could properly express. Then he paid for his order, tipped his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, and left the bakery, leaving Emma standing behind the counter, trying to understand what had just happened and what she'd agreed to. The rest of the day passed in a blur of contradictory emotions. Part of Emma felt excited, almost giddy with the unexpected possibility of attending the dance, not as invisible wallflower, but as invited guest of respected man. Another part felt terrified, imagining the reactions when she arrived with Thomas, the whispers and stares and cruel comments that would follow them throughout the evening, the social judgment he'd face for his choice, and she'd face simply for accepting. And underneath both excitement and fear ran current of suspicion, the learned wariness of someone who'd been hurt too many times to trust easily, who kept expecting the other shoe to drop, and reveal that this was all somehow mistake or mockery. By closing time, Emma had nearly convinced herself to send message declining Thomas's invitation, to protect both of them from the awkwardness and cruelty that seemed inevitable. But as she locked the bakery door and walked home through the cooling evening, she thought about how tired she was of making herself smaller, of accepting limitations other people imposed, of letting fear dictate her choices. Maybe this would end badly. Maybe the town would make it unbearable, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop assuming she didn't deserve good things simply because others had told her so for so long. Thomas Brennan had looked at her and seen someone worth inviting to a dance. Perhaps it was time Emma started seeing herself that way too, regardless of what anyone else thought. The 3 days between Thomas's invitation and the actual dance were among the longest of Emma's life. News traveled fast in Millbrook, and somehow everyone seemed to know that Thomas Brennan had invited Emma Hartwell to the harvest dance. The reactions ranged from surprise to disapproval to outright mockery, and Emma found herself subject to even more scrutiny and commentary than usual. Mrs. Peterson made pointed remarks in the bakery about people who didn't know their proper place, while younger women giggled behind their hands and speculated loudly about what Thomas could possibly be thinking, choosing her when he could have his pick of anyone in the county. Emma's mother, a practical woman who'd watched her daughter endure years of social cruelty, had mixed feelings about the situation. She worried that Emma was setting herself up for public humiliation, that attending such a prominent social event would expose her to mockery on a scale she'd successfully avoided by staying quietly in the background. But she also recognized the spark of hope in Emma's eyes, the first real excitement she'd shown about anything social in years, and couldn't bring herself to discourage it completely. Instead, she helped Emma prepare, taking out and altering one of her better dresses, helping her arrange her hair in a style that was simple but flattering, providing the kind of maternal support that said whatever happened, Emma wouldn't face it alone. Saturday evening arrived with Emma's nerves stretched to breaking point. She'd changed her mind about going at least a dozen times throughout the day, convinced herself this was a terrible mistake, then talked herself back into taking the risk. When Thomas arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, driving a well-maintained buggy and dressed in what was clearly his finest suit, Emma felt a wave of gratitude that he'd shown up, that this wasn't an elaborate joke that ended with her waiting alone while the town laughed. His expression when he saw her was warm and appreciative, and he offered his arm with the easy courtesy of someone who'd been raised to treat all people with respect, regardless of their social standing or appearance. The ride to the community hall where the dance was held took 15 minutes, and Thomas filled the time with comfortable conversation about the ranch, the upcoming winter preparations, an amusing story about one of his horses that had Emma genuinely laughing. His manner was natural rather than forced, treating this like any pleasant social outing rather than something unusual or requiring special courage. Emma found herself relaxing slightly, reminded that whatever happened at the dance itself, she was at least getting to spend evening with someone who seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, which was more than she'd experienced in longer than she could remember. They arrived at the hall as the musicians were tuning their instruments, the large room already filling with people dressed in their best clothing, the air buzzing with conversation and anticipation. The moment Emma and Thomas entered together, the buzz shifted noticeably. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned, and Emma felt the weight of dozens of stares, the collective attention of community that had spent years ignoring her, suddenly focused entirely on her presence. The judgment in those stares was palpable, a mixture of shock and disapproval and cruel amusement that made Emma's steps falter, her instinct to turn and flee nearly overwhelming her determination to stay. Thomas seemed to sense her hesitation because he placed his hand gently over hers, where it rested on his arm, a gesture of support that steadied her. He guided her into the room with confident bearing that suggested he was completely comfortable with his choice and unbothered by the reactions surrounding them. They found seats along the wall, where the women typically gathered before being asked to dance, and Thomas excused himself briefly to get them refreshments, leaving Emma sitting alone and acutely aware of the whispered conversations happening all around her. Two women she recognized as friends of Mrs. Peterson positioned themselves nearby, their voices just loud enough to ensure Emma heard every word. They discussed in exaggerated tones how surprising it was that Thomas Brennan would settle for someone like Emma when he could have any woman in the territory, speculating that perhaps he was playing some kind of joke or had lost a bet that required him to bring the most unsuitable partner he could find. Their laughter was bright and cruel, designed to hurt, and Emma felt the familiar burning in her chest that came from being treated as object of ridicule rather than person with feelings. Before she could decide whether to respond or simply endure as she'd learned to do, Thomas returned with their drinks. He'd clearly overheard the comments because his face had gone cold in a way that transformed him from friendly rancher to someone considerably more formidable. He turned to the two women and spoke in voice that carried across the immediate area, quiet but absolutely clear. He said that he'd invited Emma Hartwell to this dance because she was intelligent, talented, kind, and had more genuine grace in her smallest gesture than some people managed in their entire lives. He said he considered it privilege to be her escort for the evening, and anyone who had problem with his choice was welcome to discuss it with him privately. Though they should understand he didn't take kindly to people insulting his guest, the women's faces went red with embarrassment and anger, but they had no response to such direct confrontation from someone of Thomas's standing in the community. They moved away, still whispering, and Emma felt strange mixture of emotions: gratitude for Thomas's defense, embarrassment at being the center of such a scene, and something else that might have been the first stirrings of anger on her own behalf, rather than just resigned acceptance of how things were. The music started, and Thomas offered his hand, asking if she would honor him with the first dance. Emma hesitated, aware that taking the floor would make them the center of even more attention, that her dancing with someone like Thomas would be seen by many as presumptuous at best and laughable at worst. But she'd already come this far, and something about Thomas's steady regard gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. She placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they began to dance, Emma was acutely conscious of her size, of how different she must look compared to the petite women twirling nearby in their partners' arms. But Thomas led with confident skill that made following easy, and gradually Emma stopped thinking about how they must appear and simply experienced the movement, the music, the unexpected pleasure of dancing with someone who treated her like she belonged exactly where she was. Thomas was a good dancer, and he made her feel graceful in a way she'd never associated with herself, moving with assurance that somehow transmitted to her own steps. Around them, the other dancers had slowed or stopped entirely, watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval, to something that might have been grudging surprise. The mockery Emma had expected was there in some faces, but it was muted by Thomas's obvious competence and comfort with the situation, by the fact that he was clearly enjoying himself, rather than grimly enduring some obligatory charity dance. And as the first song ended, and transitioned into a second, something remarkable happened. Other couples gradually resumed their own dancing, the spell of judgment breaking as people returned to their own enjoyment, rather than focused entirely on criticizing Emma and Thomas. They danced 3 songs in succession, and by the third, Emma had largely forgotten to worry about being watched, had lost herself in the unexpected joy of this experience she'd convinced herself she'd never have. When Thomas finally led her back to their seats, both slightly breathless, Emma felt something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of happiness and defiance, and the dawning realization that perhaps she'd accepted limitations that didn't have to define her if she was brave enough to challenge them. Thomas Brennan had never been a man for speeches, had built his life and reputation through actions rather than words, through fair dealing and honest work that spoke louder than any rhetoric could. But standing in that community hall, seeing the cruelty directed at Emma crystallized in Margaret Chen's drunken attack, he recognized that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of cruelty, that sometimes words were necessary to challenge behavior that everyone saw but no one addressed. He spoke clearly and without anger, though the passion behind his words was evident in their careful precision. He said that he'd lived in Kansas for 15 years, had built his ranch from nothing through hard work and fair treatment of everyone he dealt with, had earned respect of the community through consistency and integrity. He said that in all those years, through all his interactions with the people of Millbrook, he'd rarely been as disappointed in this community as he was right now, watching how they treated someone who'd done nothing to deserve their scorn, except fail to meet their narrow standards of acceptable appearance. He turned to Emma and his voice softened. He said he'd been coming to her bakery for over a year, had watched her work with skill and dedication that put most people to shame, had seen her treat every customer with courtesy, even when they treated her with disdain she didn't deserve. He'd observed her kindness to children who came to the shop, noticed how she'd quietly give day-old bread to families struggling to feed themselves, witnessed her unfailing grace in the face of casual cruelty that would have broken someone with less strength. He'd asked her to this dance not out of pity or charity, but because he'd come to admire her character and wanted to know her better, wanted to spend time with someone whose inner qualities so far exceeded the superficial attributes this town seemed to value above everything else. Thomas turned back to the assembly, his expression grave. He said he understood that appearances mattered to people, that society had standards and expectations about how people should look. But he asked when exactly they'd all agreed that physical appearance was the only thing worth valuing, that someone's worth as a human being could be measured entirely by whether they fit a particular physical ideal. He asked how many of them could honestly say they possessed Emma's skill, her work ethic, her kindness in the face of constant disrespect. He asked whether any of them had considered that their own character might be far more lacking than hers, that their cruelty and judgment revealed flaws far more profound than any physical attribute they found fault with. The hall remained absolutely silent, people shifting uncomfortably as Thomas's words struck home, as he held up a mirror that reflected back their own behavior in ways that made comfortable prejudices suddenly look like the failures of character they actually were. Margaret had sunk into a chair, her face flushed with shame or anger or both, unable to maintain her attack in the face of such direct challenge. Others looked at their feet, at the walls, anywhere except at Thomas or Emma, unable to meet the implied accusation in his steady gaze. Thomas continued, saying that he'd come to this dance tonight proud to be Emma's escort, and nothing that had happened during the evening had changed that feeling. He said he'd spent time with many people in this room over the years, had done business and socialized and developed relationships with dozens of families, but few of those interactions had given him the genuine pleasure he'd experienced this evening, dancing and talking with Emma. He said that if the price of continuing to associate with her was losing the good opinion of people who valued appearance over character, he considered that a bargain he'd accept gladly. Then he did something that shifted the evening from confrontation to something more profound. He turned to Emma and said that he understood if she wanted to leave, that he'd certainly take her home if she preferred, but that he would be honored if she'd stay for the final dance, if she'd allow him one more opportunity to enjoy her company before the evening ended. The choice was hers, he said, but he wanted her to know that he wasn't embarrassed or uncomfortable or wishing he'd made a different decision about inviting her. He was grateful she'd accepted, proud to be with her, and would happily stay if she was willing. Emma stood frozen, processing everything that had just happened, feeling emotions she couldn't quite name flooding through her. The public defense Thomas had mounted on her behalf was unlike anything she'd experienced, the validation of her worth, coming from someone whose opinion clearly mattered to the community, whose character gave his words weight they might not have carried from someone with less standing. But more than that, she felt the stirring of something she'd suppressed for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Anger on her own behalf, righteous fury at all the years she'd accepted treatment she didn't deserve, at all the times she'd made herself smaller to accommodate others' cruelty. She looked around the hall at the faces of people who'd diminished her, who'd treated her as less than human, who'd used her as object of mockery to make themselves feel superior. She saw the discomfort in their expressions as Thomas's words forced them to examine behavior they'd never questioned, as they were called to account for cruelty they'd never had to defend. And Emma realized that she had a choice in this moment. She could leave, could protect herself from further potential hurt by removing herself from their judgment, or she could stay, could claim her right to occupy space in this community on her own terms rather than theirs. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, carrying across the silent hall with clarity that surprised even her. She said that she would like to stay, that she would very much like to have that final dance with Thomas. She said she wanted to thank him not just for inviting her tonight, but for seeing her as a person rather than just a body to be judged, for valuing qualities that had nothing to do with appearance, for having the courage to stand against a community's prejudice, even when it would have been easier to go along with it. Then Emma did something she'd never done before, something that felt both terrifying and liberating. She turned to address the assembled townspeople, the neighbors and customers, and people she'd lived among her entire life, without ever really being part of their community. She said she'd spent 23 years in Millbrook, working quietly, staying in the background, accepting their treatment because she'd believed what they'd told her about her worth. She said she'd convinced herself that their judgment was fair, that she deserved their contempt, because she didn't meet their standards of acceptable appearance. But tonight, she continued, standing here watching Thomas Brennan defend her character and value as a person, she'd realized something important. The problem wasn't her, wasn't her size or her appearance or anything about her physical self. The problem was a community that had decided physical appearance was the only thing worth valuing, that treated people as objects to be judged rather than individuals to be known. She said she was done accepting their limitations, done making herself invisible to spare them discomfort, done believing that their prejudice reflected her worth rather than their own failure of character and compassion. Emma's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the words flowing from somewhere deep inside, years of suppressed anger and hurt transforming into clarity and conviction. She said the bakery would continue operating because she loved her work and took pride in her skill, but she would no longer tolerate disrespect from customers who thought purchasing her goods entitled them to treat her poorly. She said she would continue living in Millbrook because it was her home, but she would no longer accept that her place was on the margins, invisible and ashamed. She said that anyone who had problem with her presence or her appearance was welcome to their opinion, but she was done letting their opinions determine how she lived her life or thought about herself. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted Margaret's attack or Thomas's defense. This was stunned silence, the collective realization that they'd underestimated Emma Hartwell, had dismissed someone who possessed strength and eloquence they'd never bothered to discover, because they'd decided her appearance told them everything they needed to know. Some faces showed shame, genuine recognition of how poorly they'd behaved and how wrong they'd been. Others showed defensiveness, the resistance of people confronted with truths they weren't ready to acknowledge. But all of them were listening. All of them were seeing Emma, perhaps for the first time, as actual person, rather than object of scorn. The musicians, sensing that the moment called for action, rather than continued awkward silence, struck up the final waltz of the evening. Thomas offered his arm to Emma with expression of profound respect, and she took it, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they began to move to the music, something remarkable happened. Slowly, one by one, other couples joined them. Not everyone. Some people remained seated in stubborn maintenance of their prejudices, but enough that Emma and Thomas were no longer alone on the floor, were instead part of community dance that included them rather than isolated them. As they waltzed, Thomas leaned close enough to speak quietly so only Emma could hear. He said he was proud of her for finding her voice tonight, for standing up for herself in a way that would make it impossible for the town to dismiss or ignore her anymore. He said he'd meant everything he'd said about her character and worth, that inviting her tonight hadn't been gesture of charity, but genuine desire to spend time with someone he'd come to admire deeply. He asked, with the slight hesitation of someone taking a risk, whether she might consider allowing him to call on her properly, whether they might continue getting to know each other beyond this one evening. Emma looked up at him, this man who'd seen her when no one else had, who'd defended her when he had nothing personal to gain and everything to risk, who'd treated her with the respect and kindness she'd almost forgotten she deserved. She felt hope rising in her chest, cautious but real. The possibility that maybe her life wasn't defined by the limitations others had imposed, that maybe there were people in the world who could see past surface to recognize the person beneath. She said yes, she would like that very much, would welcome the opportunity to know him better, to see whether the connection they'd discovered tonight might develop into something deeper and more lasting. As the final notes of the waltz faded and the dance officially ended, Emma and Thomas left the community hall together, walking out into the cool Kansas night under stars that seemed brighter than usual, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the significance of what had happened. Behind them, the hall gradually emptied, townspeople departing in small groups, many of them discussing the evening's events in hushed tones, processing the uncomfortable truths they'd been forced to confront. The weeks that followed brought changes to Millbrook that were subtle but real. Not everyone transformed overnight. Prejudice that deep-rooted didn't disappear just because it had been challenged once. But some people began treating Emma differently, with the kind of cautious respect that suggested they'd heard Thomas's words and Emma's response and recognized they needed to reconsider their behavior. Mrs. Peterson still came to the bakery, but her orders were delivered with slightly less disdain. The younger women who'd giggled at Emma's expense became quieter in her presence, their mockery no longer quite so comfortable when it had been so publicly called out. Thomas became a regular presence in Emma's life, calling on her twice weekly, taking her for buggy rides across the prairie, sitting in the bakery after hours talking about everything and nothing, while Emma worked on the next day's preparations. Their courtship was proper and slow, building on foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than rushing toward predetermined conclusion. The town watched with interest that ranged from approval to continued skepticism. But even the skeptics kept their judgments quieter than they had before, aware that both Thomas and Emma had proven themselves willing to confront criticism directly, rather than accepting it silently. 6 months after the harvest dance, on a spring morning when the prairie was turning green and the air carried promise of renewal, Thomas proposed to Emma in the bakery kitchen, where they'd first had the conversation that led to everything else. He said he'd fallen in love not despite who she was, but because of it, that every day spent knowing her had confirmed his initial instinct that she was someone extraordinary, whose worth had nothing to do with surface attributes that meant nothing compared to character, kindness, strength, and grace. He said he wanted to build life with her, wanted to wake up every day, knowing he got to share it with someone who taught him that real beauty had nothing to do with meeting society's narrow standards and everything to do with being genuinely good person. Emma said yes without hesitation, no longer questioning whether she deserved happiness or whether people would approve, having learned that her worth wasn't determined by others' judgments, but by her own character and choices. She'd found her voice that night at the harvest dance, had discovered that standing up for herself didn't destroy her as she'd feared, but instead freed her to claim life she'd thought was impossible. And she'd found a partner who saw her truly, who valued everything about her that actually mattered, who'd been willing to stand against an entire community's prejudice because he recognized that some things were more important than social approval. Their wedding was a simple affair attended by those who genuinely wished them well, free from the obligation to include people who'd shown themselves to be unkind. They built life together that was rich with shared purpose and mutual respect, Thomas's ranch prospering under their joint management, Emma's baking business growing as word spread about her exceptional skill. They became known not as the unlikely couple who'd shocked Millbrook, but simply as the Brennans, respected members of the community whose relationship demonstrated that love and partnership could be built on foundations far stronger than superficial attraction. Years later, when people told the story of the harvest dance, when Thomas Brennan danced with Emma Hartwell and the town went silent, it wasn't told as story about charity or unlikely romance. It was told as story about courage, about standing up to prejudice, about refusing to accept limitations others tried to impose, about recognizing that true character had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with how people treated each other in moments that revealed who they really were. Emma and Thomas had both shown more character that night than most people managed in entire lifetimes, and Millbrook was better for having witnessed it, having been forced to examine their own failings and hopefully becoming slightly more compassionate community as a result. Emma never forgot what it felt like to be mocked for her size, to be dismissed and diminished by people who judged her worth entirely by appearance. But she also never forgot what it felt like to stand up for herself, to claim her own value, to discover that one person, seeing and respecting her truth, was worth more than approval of dozens who never bothered to look past surface. She'd been transformed not by losing weight or changing her body to meet others' standards, but by refusing to accept that their standards had any legitimate claim on her life or her happiness. That was the real victory, the one that lasted, the one that allowed her to build life of genuine fulfillment, rather than spending it seeking validation from people who'd never been capable of seeing her clearly in the first place.